Most people think feminine power is about being soft, about being quiet, about being nurturing. They think it's passive, yielding, or worse, obedient. But none of that is true. That version of femininity didn't come from nature. It came from culture, from centuries of systems that had a vested interest in keeping women in a certain place, behind the scenes, behind the men, behind the power. Over time, this idea got repeated so often, it became normal. The ideal woman was the one who smiled politely, served silently, and never questioned authority. Power, if she had any, was supposed to be hidden, polite, indirect, never too loud. Even well-meaning ideas reinforced it. Some strands of feminism tried to make women powerful by encouraging them to act more like men, be assertive, be aggressive, chase dominance. The problem wasn't the ambition, it was the model. It still assumed that masculine behavior was the standard. That strength had only one face, that power could only be force. But feminine power was never about mimicking the masculine, and it was never about submission either. Feminine strength doesn't need to shout, it doesn't need to overpower. It works in a different way, one that doesn't rely on control, but on influence, one that doesn't conquer, but shapes. It's not passive, it's not loud, it's something else entirely. This is where polarity theory becomes useful. Jung called it the anima and animus. Taoist thought calls it yin and yang. Every person carries both. One is not better than the other. They're just different forms of energy, different expressions, different tools. Masculine energy is linear, focused, driven by structure. It breaks through. It directs. Feminine energy moves in cycles. It receives, nurtures, and transforms. It creates life, not just physically, but in every sense. Art, connection, language, collaboration. That's feminine intelligence at work. But for centuries, the masculine model of power was the one society valued, the one it rewarded. So feminine strength had to hide. Or worse, it had to perform. Watered-down versions of it showed up in advertising, in politics, in workplaces, polished, controlled, packaged in a way that didn't threaten the system it was in. But the real version is different. It doesn't apologize for being intuitive. It doesn't trade empathy for efficiency. It doesn't ask for permission. And it doesn't need to become masculine to matter. The truth is simple. Feminine power is not about competing with masculine strength. It's about redefining what strength actually means. Power is usually explained in one direction. One person commands, another obeys. One gets more, others get less. That's how it's taught in school, how it shows up in history books, in governments, in companies. The more you control, the more powerful you are. That's the standard idea. But that's not the full story. Nietzsche called it the will to power. Not the will to survive, not even the will to pleasure, but the will to expand, to become more, to overcome. For him, every living thing pushes forward, trying to grow beyond its limits. But he didn't mean brute strength or domination. He meant the drive to shape the world through one's own values. Foucault looked at it differently. He said power isn't a thing you own, it's a relationship. It works through systems, not just individuals. Power exists in language, in knowledge, in rules. It spreads, it organizes. It defines what people can say, what they can be, what they're allowed to imagine. Then came Audre Lorde. She talked about a kind of power that didn't fit either model, a form most people ignored. She called it the erotic, not in the limited sense of sexuality, but in the sense of life force, creative energy, deep inner knowing. She argued that this kind of power was the most threatening to the systems we live under, not because it destroyed them, but because it refused to obey their terms. All three were pointing towards something bigger. Power isn't just force. It isn't just position. And it definitely isn't just about control. The problem is, most of the world has been built on a narrow idea, one that values efficiency over empathy, command over collaboration, results over process. That kind of power builds fast, but it also burns out. It wins short-term battles, but struggles to sustain long-term change. True power works differently. It multiplies instead of subtracting. It listens instead of silencing. It builds connections instead of cutting them. Control is about holding. Real power is about creating. One is based in fear. The other moves through trust. That's why feminine power, in its original sense, doesn't fit into the old models. It's not aggressive, it's not about conquest. It's rooted in growth, awareness, and movement. It doesn't rely on taking. It's based on giving form to ideas, shaping culture, building relationships, setting rhythms. This doesn't mean it's passive, it means it operates from a different logic, one that values intuition, community, and expression. It shows up in the way ecosystems organize themselves, in the way stories pass through generations, in the way people gather, adapt, and build systems of care. It doesn't need authority to be effective. It doesn't depend on status. It works through attention, through presence, through influence. You can't always measure it, but it shifts things, it moves conversations, it changes direction. This is what gets missed when power is only measured by who commands and who obeys. True power is generative. It brings new ideas to life, it connects people to each other. It brings out what's possible, not just what's profitable. And this is what feminine power looks like. Not weaker, not softer, not a reaction to masculine power. A different structure altogether. A model built on understanding, not on dominance. Not because it's more ethical, but because it lasts longer. It evolves, it adapts, it creates new forms instead of locking into fixed shapes. That's not just a new way of thinking about power. That's a shift in what we value, what we build, and what kind of world we actually want to live in. In school, most people are taught that men built the world, that they led wars, created governments, invented systems. And while many did, that version of history leaves out a lot. It ignores entire civilizations where women weren't just participants, they were leaders. They shaped laws, they guided people. They held influence that wasn't hidden but accepted, and sometimes expected. Long before modern borders, in different parts of the world, there were societies that didn't organize power the way we do now. In some places, leadership wasn't based on strength or wealth, but wisdom, care, and social balance. In many of these cultures, power flowed through the maternal line. Status wasn't passed from father to son, but from mother to daughter. Women owned land, they made political decisions, they weren't exceptions, they were the structure. In West Africa, the Ashanti Kingdom allowed queens to rule alongside kings. They had their own councils. Their voices carried equal weight. In pre-colonial Indonesia, women were spiritual leaders, merchants, and advisors. In parts of ancient China, before Confucian values became dominant, women held roles as shamans and legal authorities. In indigenous societies across North America, women were the keepers of the land and decision-makers in community matters. Their roles weren't ceremonial, they were functional. But this part of history rarely gets told. When people talk about rulers, they name kings. When they speak of revolution, they mention generals. And when they define power, they point to force. But there were women who led not because they mimicked men, but because they brought a different kind of strength. Cleopatra wasn't just a queen of Egypt. She was a strategist, a negotiator. Fluent in multiple languages, she handled foreign policy in an empire surrounded by threats. She didn't inherit peace. She maintained it through diplomacy and trade. Hatshepsut, who ruled centuries earlier, wasn't a placeholder. She took the title of pharaoh, wore the traditional symbols of power, and launched one of the most prosperous eras in ancient Egyptian history. She oversaw massive building projects, opened trade routes, and kept the region stable for years. After her death, later rulers tried to erase her memory. They chiseled her name off monuments, but records survived. In the kingdom of Ndongo and Matamba, Queen Nzinga resisted Portuguese colonization for decades. She built alliances, formed armies, and used politics as a weapon. At a time when European powers were expanding, she didn't back down. She adapted. She negotiated on equal terms. Then there was Hypatia, a mathematician and philosopher in Alexandria. She taught science and ethics at a time when education was dominated by men. Her work combined reason with observation, and her voice influenced scholars far beyond her own city. She wasn't a ruler by title, but her ideas held power. Joan of Arc didn't come from royalty. She claimed no position. Yet she shifted the course of French history. She led soldiers into battle, convinced nobles to listen, and stood trial for stepping outside her role. She challenged the limits placed on her, not through wealth or background, but through presence. These weren't isolated cases. These were women whose authority was real. It didn't come from copying the masculine model. It came from redefining what leadership looked like. Still, most history classes don't go into detail. Museums rarely explain it fully. Textbooks move on quickly, because history, as we know it, was mostly written by men, and often for them. So stories that didn't fit their version of power got trimmed out. The ones that remained were adjusted, softened, or silenced. That's how feminine power became invisible in plain sight. Not because it didn't exist, but because it wasn't recorded. And yet, it was there. In trade networks managed by women, in treaties formed through diplomacy, in communities held together by cooperation, not command. Feminine power wasn't absent, it was ignored. Power in the hands of the feminine has always existed, but history often chose to forget. The point isn't to say one form is better. The point is to correct the record, to expand it. Because the past wasn't just built by those who held swords and thrones, it was also shaped by those who raised leaders, formed language, protected culture, and passed on wisdom through generations. This isn't about going back, it's about awakening what never left. Most people are taught roles without even realizing it. From childhood, girls learn what's expected, not through direct commands, but through signals. What gets praised, what gets ignored, what gets punished. Speak softly, smile more, don't interrupt, don't take up space. These instructions aren't always spoken, but they're everywhere. In books, films, advertisements, schools. Over time, they don't just shape behavior, they shape identity, and the repetition turns into belief. This is internalized patriarchy, not men forcing women into place, but systems teaching women to do it to themselves. It's why many women question their competence, even when they're qualified. It's why they hesitate before speaking, even when they have the answer. It's why they say yes when they want to say no. Imposter syndrome isn't random. It's not just insecurity. It's the result of being raised in a structure that rarely saw them as the standard, where leadership, intelligence, strength were shown with male faces. So when women do succeed, the mind struggles to reconcile it. They think they got lucky, or that someone made a mistake. But this isn't just psychological, it's social. Beauty standards are a form of control, not because appearance doesn't matter, but because the rules change constantly. And staying within them takes time, money, and attention. Every hour spent trying to meet an image is an hour not spent building something else. That's the trade. Then there's emotional labor, the invisible work of keeping relationships stable, smoothing conversations, remembering birthdays, translating tone, managing tension. In homes, in offices, in public spaces, this labor is expected, but it's rarely acknowledged. It keeps groups functioning, yet it doesn't show up on reports. It doesn't count as productivity. And unpaid work? Still foundational. In most societies, women do the majority of childcare, elder care, and domestic work. Economies depend on it. Governments assume it. This isn't accidental. When women are taught to shrink, others get more room. When they question their worth, others gain power. When their time is spent maintaining appearances, they spend less of it changing systems. Society doesn't just benefit from this, it's structured around it. Bell Hooks once said, "The process begins with the recognition that the system works to keep women powerless, and that this powerlessness is internalized." Simone de Beauvoir put it another way: one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. What she meant is that womanhood, as we know it, is shaped, built over time by rules, images, expectations. But if something is built, it can be unbuilt. If it's learned, it can be questioned. The way forward isn't about rejecting everything. It's about noticing what was placed there and asking who benefits. Because what looks like insecurity might be training. What seems like doubt might be conditioning. And what appears natural may actually be the result of repetition. That's the beginning of power, not in taking control, but in understanding what shaped the limits. The next step is to challenge those limits, not by becoming something else, but by returning to what was always there underneath it. Most people live with parts of themselves they don't fully understand. Behaviors that repeat, reactions that feel automatic, thoughts that don't match who they think they are. These patterns aren't random. They come from earlier experiences, many buried or ignored. What's called shadow work is simply the process of noticing them, not to fix, but to see. The shadow isn't evil or dark. It's just everything someone was told not to be. For women, that might be ambition, or anger, or power. So they pushed it down, learned to perform what was accepted. But what's hidden doesn't disappear. It moves. It shapes choices. It shows up when least expected. Then there's the inner child, the version that first learned what was safe, what was lovable, what needed to be hidden. Reclaiming the feminine begins here, not with new habits or outward success, but with the memory of what was forgotten. The part that didn't perform, the part that didn't shrink. It also requires reconnecting with something deeper than logic. Intuition isn't guesswork. It's a way of knowing. It's what emerges when noise is quiet. It's pattern recognition that's not always verbal, and in many cultures, it was seen as a core strength, not a weakness. Across time, people used archetypes to understand parts of themselves. The mother isn't just someone who gives birth. She represents care, creation, holding space. The warrior isn't just violent. She's protective. She sets limits. She defends values. The lover isn't just romantic. She brings connection, depth, openness. The sage doesn't just know, she listens. She waits. She sees patterns. These aren't roles, they're reflections of inner potential. In one life, a woman might embody all of them at different points. Awakening the feminine means making space for each, not choosing one over the other, but knowing when each is needed. This can't happen through strategy alone. It's not something to plan in a journal. It's something that unfolds through cycles. In nature, things move in seasons: growth, rest, change. In the body, cycles teach rhythm. The menstrual cycle isn't a flaw, it's a signal. Just like the moon moves through phases, energy shifts too. Awareness of that rhythm builds trust. Many traditions speak of the divine feminine, not as a god or figure, but as a force, a way of being that values presence, feeling, interconnection. It's not better than the masculine, it's different. Where masculine energy pushes forward, feminine energy draws in. Where one builds outward, the other creates from within. In philosophy, this isn't new. Taoism speaks of yin, soft, fluid, receptive. Carl Jung wrote of the anima, the feminine part within every human mind, often neglected in men, distorted in women. When that part is embraced, things change, not externally first, but internally. Beliefs shift, choices realign. A new kind of strength appears, because to awaken the feminine is not to reject the world. It is to feel it more deeply and move through it powerfully, not louder, not harsher, but rooted, certain, and clear. And once that happens inside, everything outside adjusts. In every industry, in every part of the world, women are building new systems. Some run companies, some lead schools, some organize protests, some raise communities. They aren't all following the same model, but they share something in common. They aren't mimicking traditional power. They're using a different approach entirely. Influence isn't always about dominance. Sometimes it's about presence. Not the loudest voice, but the one people pause to hear. Take Wangari Maathai. She didn't build her legacy through control. She planted trees, mobilized women, defended land. Her work reshaped environmental activism and local economies. Or Lema Gbawi. She led a peace movement that ended a civil war. No weapons, just organized action, strategy, persistence. Or someone like Reshma Saujani. She founded Girls Who Code, not by competing in tech as it existed, but by widening access, by asking different questions. Feminine leadership isn't soft, it's focused. It doesn't follow old scripts, it writes new ones, but power on its own isn't enough. It needs skill, and influence can be sharpened. Speaking with conviction doesn't require volume. It comes from clarity. Say less, mean more. Use pauses. Remove filler. End sentences. Don't trail them off with doubt. Practice saying no without explanation. That's a full sentence. Boundaries aren't walls, they're structure. Grace in setting them doesn't mean apologizing for them. It means stating them calmly and holding them firmly. Boundaries let others know what's yours, what you protect, what you don't hand over. Emotional intelligence isn't about being liked. It's about seeing the room clearly, noticing what's unsaid, reading patterns, naming tension, redirecting attention when it drifts. Women often get told they're too emotional, but in leadership, emotions are data. Understanding them gives range. Suppressing them creates distortion. Real influence is not in forcing agreement, it's in creating understanding. Feminine principles don't reject logic. They add to it. They bring context, nuance, relationship. That's how movements gain momentum. That's how culture shifts. Every system people rely on today was made up by someone. Rules didn't fall from the sky. Most tables weren't built with women in mind. That's why feminine leadership doesn't ask for a seat at the table. It builds a new one where competition isn't the only way forward, where care is seen as intelligence, where inclusion is design, not decoration. These aren't just ideals, they're strategies, they're frameworks. They work in business, education, health, policy. It's not about flipping the power structure. It's about changing what power means. And when that happens, leadership stops being a role. It becomes a method, a way of moving through systems with intention, with clarity, and with results. In most systems, people are taught to push, to argue, to prove, to win. Success is often linked to force, getting results through effort, control, pressure. But there's another concept that challenges that idea completely. David R. Hawkins made a distinction that changes how people view power. He said, "Force always moves against something. It requires resistance, it uses effort to create outcomes. But power doesn't push. It doesn't depend on opposition. It draws people in. It doesn't demand. It attracts." In business, this is the difference between selling through pressure versus creating something people seek out. One exhausts, the other sustains. In relationships, force tries to control through rules, silence, withdrawal. Power builds trust. It doesn't chase or trap. It makes space, holds ground, and allows room to choose. In families, force might show up as strictness, doing something because I said so. Power leads through example. Through consistency, it builds respect, not obedience. Force is fast but short-lived. It can produce action quickly, but it needs to keep applying pressure to maintain control. Power lasts longer. It may move slower, but it doesn't require constant effort. Once it's present, things move toward it without being pushed. Masculine energy often values speed, logic, action. That has its place. But without balance, it becomes rigid. It burns out. Feminine energy values rhythm, awareness, influence. It doesn't overpower. It redirects. It sees what others miss, not because it's smarter, but because it listens longer. In meetings, force might interrupt, cut off, try to dominate the room. Power waits, then speaks clearly, once, and people listen. In a negotiation, force demands more, threatens to walk away. Power knows value and doesn't chase. Force depends on tension. Power works with alignment. This isn't about one being better than the other. They serve different roles. But most systems overvalue force. They reward the loudest voice, the firmest grip, the hardest push, and they burn out the people trying to keep up. Feminine power isn't soft or passive. It's magnetic. It influences without controlling. It shifts rooms without raising volume. It's not afraid to move differently, because it doesn't need external approval to be valid. The idea isn't to replace one type of strength with another. It's to recognize that presence, clarity, and consistency often do more than force ever could. Because you don't need to push to be powerful. Your presence is the revolution. If you've been taught to stay small, quiet, or agreeable, that wasn't by accident. Systems prefer predictability. They reward silence not because silence is right, but because it's easier to manage. But silence doesn't build anything. And playing small doesn't serve anyone. Your presence matters, not just in private, not just when it's safe, not only after being asked. Your voice, without apology, without adjusting tone to be more acceptable, that matters. You don't need permission to lead, or credentials to speak, or approval to take up space. What you've lived, what you've learned, and what you've felt, that's knowledge. That's what gives you power. This isn't about trying to be louder than others. It's about speaking without lowering your volume for comfort. It's about building things that reflect what you value, even if no one has done it that way before. The feminine isn't something soft that needs protection. It's something strong that rebuilds, that listens when others argue, that plants when others consume, that includes when others divide. The world doesn't need more control. It needs more creation. And that creation starts with presence, with someone deciding that being real is more important than being liked. That showing up fully, with strength, care, knowledge, and clarity, is more useful than fitting in. When women stand in that, things shift. In workplaces, it changes decisions. In families, it changes what's passed on. In communities, it creates structures that last longer, serve more, and harm less. This isn't a trend. It's not a style of speaking, or a leadership technique, or a movement tied to a moment. This is a method, a way of being, a way of showing up without compromise, of creating momentum without force. Because when women rise, everyone rises. Systems grow, cultures evolve, assumptions break. If you've been told that your strength is too much, your calm too quiet, your softness too weak, your clarity too direct, you've already been shown what people fear, not because it's wrong, but because it works. So don't wait for permission. Don't wait for better timing. Don't wait until you feel ready. Your story matters. Your softness matters. Your fire matters. Now build with it. Speak with it. Stand in it. Own the space you're in, because nothing about the world improves when women hold back. She listens, not to respond, but to understand. She walks, not to follow, but to leave a path. She builds, not for herself alone, but for all who come after. She has been called too loud, too quiet, too soft, too strong. She's been told to wait, to ask, to tone it down, to let others speak first. But she remembers now, not because someone handed her power, but because she stopped asking for it. In her hands, power is not control. It is care. It is structure that holds without caging. It is presence without pressure. She speaks and the room shifts, not because of volume, but because of truth. She loves without owning. She teaches without forcing. She leads without pushing. This is not new. This is not a trend. This is a return. From the healer who works without applause, to the leader who builds teams instead of empires, to the artist who speaks through creation, not conquest, she does not fight for space. She fills it. She does not demand to be seen. She shows up and sight adjusts. Her strength is not one she borrowed, it is one she remembered, because she was never broken. She was never too much. She was always power, waiting to remember herself. Thank you for following us through to the end of this educational content. If this is the kind of content you like, kindly like the video, share and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Thank you.